Hello everyone, my name is Rohan Kulkarni and I'm a PhD student at University of Toronto Centre for Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies. I want to extend a warm, socially distanced greeting to all my colleagues who are watching and participating in this year's online conference. I'm so thrilled to be presenting today, and I want to thank CATR SQT for the opportunity to present in this way rather than not at all. Special shout out goes to Nicole, Sylvain, Erin, and everyone else who took on the challenge of hosting and organizing an online conference so we wouldn't miss out on the chance to present our work. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which I am presenting today, Toronto. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and as a settler and immigrant, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. The title of my presentation is Between Two Worlds, Navigating Indo-Canadian Identities in Anoush Irani's The Men in White. I'll be talking about the play The Men in White as an example of South Asian Canadian theatre that explores the complexities of space and identity experienced by Canada's many South Asian diasporas. In a very real and present way, Irani's play tries to express and perform the relationship between Canada and India and the imbalances of power that define this relationship. But before I get into the play, I want to offer some context around Canada's South Asian diaspora and diaspora theatre and how these are tied to Canada's multiculturalism policy. I do this not only to welcome those people into the conversation who may not be very familiar with South Asian theatre, but also to emphasize the importance of plays like The Men in White in challenging the way a majority of Canadians might understand multiculturalism, how people might imagine Indian or South Asian cultures and histories, and of course the ongoing role of Canada as a Western neo-colonial power. So multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the most pervasive national discourse in Canada, which has been propagated for the last 40 years. It is present on the level of government funding, individual artistic process, and audience receptions. The idea of collective difference or unity in diversity is responsible for constructing a national imaginary where diaspora communities are awarded with the privilege of being Canadian. Multiculturalism became officially entrenched in federal legislation beginning in 1982 with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, although it had been a popular concept throughout the earlier decade with Pierre Trudeau's support and the introduction of multicultural policy in 1971. Conversations about multiculturalism in Canada were, however, quite late given its history of immigrant influx. In fact, South Asians had arrived on the West Coast as far back as the 1890s. But following the economic boom in the 1960s, Canada had to promote an intake of foreign populations to feed the burgeoning industrial and agricultural sectors, as a result of which people from the Indian subcontinent as well as South Asian diaspora from Southeast Africa and the Caribbean, began arriving in large numbers. Before this time, the immigration policies were rather restrictive and often did not hide their racial bias when it came to welcoming migrant populations from the South Asian subcontinent. The impact of multiculturalism was felt by arts organizations across the country. Suddenly, there was money available for South Asian communities to engage in artistic self-expression. This was a favorable development for those immigrants who had until now been preoccupied with settling into their state as new Canadians, both economically and socially. They were now able to perform and express their identities. However, the primary audience for such artistic expression was within their respective communities, and the performances often relied on nostalgia and a reaffirmation of cultural values. These performances would be staged at community venues such as temples or school gymnasiums, and they were primarily in local languages, the most common being Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati. As a result, this general trend in North America emerged, where these plays were rarely political or critical, and they often relied on perpetuating a unified sense of Indianness by borrowing heavily from pop culture, especially Bollywood. Traditional song and dance were celebrated, as was an essentialist and nostalgic conception of Indian identity, which did not include the multiplicity of voices that constitute the subcontinent. Since the performances were not presented in a Canadian context, they failed to create a space for critical dialogue. But the biggest flaw in Canada's multicultural approach to the arts was how arts practices outside of the English and French cultures were not even considered professional until the last decade of the 20th century. They received funding from the Multiculturalism Directorate rather than from arts councils, and the Directorate encouraged the festival-like and nostalgic theater practices noted among South Asians that I was just describing. Only in 1991 and onwards did arts councils recognize non-Western performance cultures as professional. If not for the Multiculturalism Directorate and the way it forced South Asian artists to create mostly folkloric and nostalgic work, we could have had a more robust culture of South Asian original playwriting and performance creation here in Canada. But anyway, in the past 20 or so years, South Asian artists have made their presence felt through performances at nationally recognized venues. Playwrights like Ravi Jan, Rahul Verma, Anushree Roy, Anush Irani, Pamela Sinha, and Anita Majumdar have presented their work across Canada with diverse audience attendance and positive responses from mainstream theater culture. These playwrights have also brought topical issues facing South Asians to the forefront and are interested in reaching wider audiences, sharing their experiences with not only members of the South Asian community, but increasingly with other cultures who occupy the same Canadian space. They're able to create a dialogue about things like racism, patriarchy, and the challenges of assimilation. These plays aren't nostalgic, and they aim to show how identity negotiation is an ongoing and politically significant process for South Asian diaspora. This signals a growing generation of South Asian artists who are eager to engage in cross-cultural conversations. Leading this pack is Indo-Canadian playwright and novelist Anush Irani. He grew up in Mumbai, India, or Bombay as he prefers to call it, and moved to Vancouver to study creative writing at the University of British Columbia in 1998. His 2003 play, Bombay Black, won 5 Dora Mae Vermoor Awards, including Outstanding New Play. All 3 of his plays, Bombay Black, The Matka King, and The Men in White, were shortlisted for the Governor-General's Award for Drama. His cultural background is Irani, which is a community of Iranian diaspora in India who practice the Zoroastrian faith. Most of Irani's work revolves around his beloved hometown of Bombay, which continues to be central to The Men in White, but this particular play also tells a uniquely South Asian Canadian story. Set simultaneously at a cricket club in Vancouver and a chicken shop in Dongri, a poor neighborhood of Bombay, The Men in White follows the journey of Abdul, an immigrant who is trying to bring his brother Hassan over to Canada to join their local cricket team. While Hassan culls chickens in Dongri, woos his girlfriend Hasina, and dreams of a better life in Canada, Abdul struggles with his legal status, works for little pay, and faces social exclusion as an immigrant who speaks only broken English. Abdul learns quickly that sponsoring his brother will be no easy feat. In addition to the difficult legal and financial process, he faces backlash from his teammates, who are also immigrants, reminding Abdul that conflicts and prejudices from back home are never quite left behind. The Men in White is an example of South Asian Canadian theatre that is unafraid to engage in a critique of economic conditions and social relations back home. Irani does not seek to exoticize or romanticize India and crushes any expectations of nostalgia in the play's opening scene, where we see an 18-year-old Hassan Siddiqui wearing an apron covered in blood and surrounded by dead chickens and flies. This is a picture of reality for many people in contemporary India. It is far from the representations of India seen in the West, which tend to offer celebratory, colorful, exotic, and sexualized depictions of Indian culture. Hassan complains to his father about being unhappy as a chicken cutter, declaring how envious he is of his brother because he moved to Canada and managed to get out of here. In his interactions with Hasina, Hassan reveals how deeply insecure he is about his socioeconomic status, fearing that he might never be good enough for someone like Hasina to marry. While she aspires to be a doctor, Hassan knows he's condemned to being a chicken cutter for the rest of his life. And even when the pair do admit their feelings to one another, they're confronted with the reality of gang violence in their slum. At no point throughout The Men in White does Irani frame India as a site for diasporic nostalgia. Rather, he positions the homeland as a place of religious strife and economic inequality. While the play is by no means a heavy or serious drama throughout, I think Irani makes a conscious choice to show his Canadian audience a side of India that resists exoticized tropes and stereotypes. At the same time, he also resists the representation of India as merely a place of poverty, inequality, and suffering. Hassan's story is also full of hope, love, family ties, and the desire to belong. One of the few times Hassan appears genuinely happy is when he finds out he'll be going to Canada to play in a cricket team alongside his brother. Hasina shows him photos of Vancouver on her laptop, and Hassan naively dreams about practicing his English, visiting the steam clock, and possibly having a good life outside the confines of Dongri. Irani contrasts this idealistic vision and expectation of Canada by presenting the reality of Hassan's brother, Abdul's condition. After coming to Canada 5 years ago on a visitor visa with his sponsor promising him residency, Abdul was made to overstay his visit and now lives illegally. He hides in the shadows and in constant fear of the authorities, which makes it easier for the employer to exploit him and pay him very little. Abdul has absolutely no family in Canada and pines for home, while Hassan, on the other side of the world, is desperate to leave everything behind and start a life in Canada. Only when Abdul happens upon a cricket club does he feel revived. Participating in India's most revered sport with a group of immigrant men is the closest thing he has to a community in Canada. Through the character of Abdul, Irani asks the audience to look beyond their preconceived notions of the ideal immigrant and consider that not everyone who comes to Canada will realize their dreams of a better life. He also offers a unique perspective on the immigrant experience by setting up Abdul's relationship with the doctor, which serves as the main conflict of this play. Doc originally hails from Bombay's Parsi community, which is a community of Iranian diaspora that practices the Zoroastrian faith. Doc would be considered an ideal immigrant who arrived in Canada legally and now contributes significantly to the economy as a well-established doctor. He also takes immense pride in being Canadian, defiantly correcting Abdul when he calls Doc an Indian. And when Abdul pushes Doc to reveal why he's hesitant to sponsor Hassan's visa application, Doc says, quote, "I don't think your brother will go back, okay? I think he'll stay on, just like you. It's people like you who give Indians a bad name. You sneak into this country, you stay on, and you make it hard for people like us," unquote. Further along in this conversation and confrontation, Doc also reveals his Islamophobia. He repeatedly mentions how aggressive Abdul is being and tries to paint him as violent or bloodthirsty, a common anti-Muslim trope in Indian culture. He tries to justify his hatred of Muslims because he lived through the communal riots of Bombay in 1993, which we later find out is how he lost his son. As a Parsi man, Doc was caught in the middle of riots with no allegiance to either side. A group of Hindus killed his son, thinking of the 8-year-old boy as a Muslim boy. The source of Doc's rage is this violence, and he tries to dissociate himself from his past by wholeheartedly embracing Canada, along with Canada's rampant Islamophobia. At one point, Doc storms out of the locker room after he yells, quote, "I will not allow another Muslim to enter this country. This is my country now. Stay out of it," unquote. Through this character dynamic, Irani draws attention to the legacy of colonialism in present-day diasporic reality. The communal riots between Hindus and Muslims in Bombay were a direct result of over a century and a half of division sowed by the British Empire during their colonization of the Indian subcontinent. The bloodiest consequence of this division was the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, which killed thousands and displaced millions. The effects of the ongoing Hindu-Muslim conflict have spilled over into South Asian diaspora and Canada, serving as a reminder to the audience that despite the banner of multiculturalism and the systematic attempt to depoliticize diaspora communities, many of them are still grappling with the effects of colonialism. As a final comment about the play, I also find it very telling that though there is a clear exploration of otherness, racism, and Islamophobia in this play, there are no white characters. Irani instead goes the route of showing how oppression is codified in Canadian society and therefore enacted by the South Asian immigrants themselves. I argue that this is a scathing critique of multiculturalism and a pointed departure from the unity and diversity narrative, highlighting the inherently political identities of Canada's South Asian diaspora. In conclusion, while South Asian theatre is still relatively new and marginal to the Canadian theatre scene, playwrights like Anosh Irani do not shy away from exploring the socio-political realities of diaspora in the here and now. They challenge oppressive structures both back home in Canada, as well as deconstruct and de-exoticize the imagined homeland. Plays like The Men in White have the capacity to engage audiences in meaningful and often difficult conversations that will trouble the hierarchies established by multiculturalism and provide a deeper understanding of South Asian Canadian identity and the South Asian Canadian experience. That brings me to the end. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and participating in my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or you would like to engage in any type of discussion, please feel free to share your thoughts with me. Thank you, and stay safe.